It's a joy to welcome both members and guests to what I think is the most anticipated program of the season. Kathy, if we don't start soon, Kathy's going to bolt. Kathy said she thought maybe we would have 25 people. This is a full house and flowing over. Everyone in Greenville knows Kathy, or they knows of her, and if they don't, they should. To say that she enriches the lives of everyone around her is an understatement. Her talents, her gifts, and her willingness to help anybody who asks for help is legendary. And the personal story that Kathy has agreed to share with us today may help to explain her compassionate view, not only of Greenville, but of world history. Give you a little background, perhaps if you didn't know Kathy. She is a shareholder at the law firm of Hainsworth, Sinkler, Boyd. She serves as a bond counselor for many of South Carolina's leading hospitals, including the Greenville Health System. She serves on the board of this museum, the Greenville Symphony, the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, the Upstate South Carolina Alliance, the Greenville Humane Society. Kim Pittman is here, the Woodlands at Furman, and the Board of Trustees at Furman, where she was the chairman. Found it interesting as I was sort of getting this thing ready, that while Kathy serves on many boards, within a year she is chairing those boards. She does her work. I think the work that Kathy's doing on this board has also contributed to the reputation of Greenville across this country. What she does is important work. A year ago, this is a funny story, Kathy served as the president of the National Bond Lawyers Association. You met where? Washington. She said she was the only president in the history of that organization who had to say, I'm from Greenville, South Carolina. Everyone else said Boston, New York, Philadelphia. They didn't have to say the state. We have Kathy. But I'm not finished. Kathy has been named to the 50 most influential in Greenville. She's one of South Carolina's super lawyers, and also named Women Who Lead by the Greenville Business Magazine. And just a few weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, Furman University awarded Kathy with the Honorary Alumni Award for her significant contributions to Furman's welfare, prestige, and pursuit of excellence. Surrounded by her son, William, and her daughter, Kathleen, when Kathy was given the award, 700 people stood up and applauded. But for me, obviously, the most important part of Kathy's community service was her immediate willingness to co-found the American History Book Club. And with that, she became my best friend and remains my best friend. And as a best friend, I assumed I really knew Kathy. You never know how really well you knew your friends sometimes. I knew her mother was English. I knew Kathy had this horrible habit of putting milk or cream in her tea. She makes great Sally Lunn at Christmas. Her gingerbread is to die for. She's just all the way around. But what I did not know until very recently was the story that Kathy is going to share with you today, and it is quite a story. So join me in welcoming Greenville's Kathy McKinney.
Whoa, I'm overwhelmed. Emily and I have a rule that we believe in very short introductions, so she just broke that rule. And honestly, I really thought there would be about 25 people here. I truly didn't think that many people would want to hear this story. But we'll begin. In your chairs, if you can share, because I didn't think we were going to have as many people. This is, truly didn't. This is a map of Germany and Austria in 1946. And what we want to pay attention to are where the various zones are: the British zone, the Soviet zone, the French zone, the American zone. And then look down at Austria, which has a U.S. zone, a Soviet zone, a British zone, and a French zone. We're going to be doing that. I'm going to be using a couple words that I'll just use as abbreviations. One will be DP, which means displaced person, and the other will be UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, called UNRWA, which actually preceded the founding of the United Nations. So we're going to begin and see how this goes. I'm going to point out some things that are on these tables that you can come and look at. That's my father, and there's some pictures of my mom over there. But we're going to start out with like 3 different subjects, but believe me, they're going to come together, and they'll make sense if we hold on to it here. And I'm going to go probably about 40 minutes, and I'll try not to go much longer. Okay, my talk today covers what appears to be 3 different subjects, but subjects that are very much integrally related. My mother, who is in the postcard that you received for the notice of this meeting, she's the one in the uniform. The period between 1919 and 1951, first in England, then Germany, and then Austria, and finally the refugee crisis in Europe from 1945 to 1951, of which there's very little scholarship on this subject. Okay, my mother. My mother, Kathleen, and I'm named Kathleen, my daughter's named Kathleen, so the airlines just get us all mixed up. But my mother, Kathleen, was born in 1911 in Dover, England. Her father was training to be a hotel manager, having already worked at the Ritz in Paris, and now at a prominent hotel, the Royal Court, in Dover on the coast of England, which catered to the British aristocracy, high government officials, and literary figures. In fact, I checked the English census of April 2nd, 1911, which is online, and the entry at the hotel guest registry that day included Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Edinburgh. Her mother was a young English woman from the countryside who had recently won a photography contest as one of the most beautiful women in England. My father, her mother's grandfather, was a tradesman that was fascinated with cameras and mechanical things and had ventured into photography as a hobby. As was beginning to happen in England, members of the trade class were moving up as eventually this family became one of the largest home builders in the Bournemouth area, which is in south east part of England. And one son ran for mayor of Bournemouth, and another with engineering ability, of which I have absolutely none, set up manufacturing facilities for British Overseas Airways Corporation. My mother engaged in a happy childhood, playing at Dover Castle and enjoying the life of a young girl, attending Miss Court School for Girls. All went well until late summer of 1914, when the First World War broke out. A little-known fact is that as the U.S. interned citizens of Japanese heritage during World War II, the English did the same with residents who had German connections or heritage. Although my mother's father, Charles Lemser, did not speak German, he was a German citizen since his mother was German, and insisted on returning to Berlin to have their child in 1885. His father was a bank manager, according to the marriage certificate issued in 1910 in England. However, the hotel in Dover was strategically located on the coast of England, facing France, and catered to, as I said, a clientele that would be involved in high-level British government. As a result, Charles Lemser, my grandfather, was caught without any notice and without any evidence of being a spy in the net of suspected German spies. He was interned in Alexander Palace in London, which was reserved for higher-ranking Germans. In my baby book, my mother lists her grandmother on her father's side as Hedwig von Bernhardi, which is an unusual German name. I researched that name, and the von Bernhardis had been ambassadors to the Russian czars, and one was unfortunately a general in the German army on the Eastern Front during World War I. So I believe that probably put her family on the list. So with this additional information, Charles Lemser appears to have had connections to Germany, which would have caught the attention of the British government. My mother remembers going as a 6-year-old girl to visit her father, who was interned at Alexander Palace, and jeered at from the train station and handed a white feather as she and her mother made their way to see her father on weekend visits. Her father spent his days in boredom from 1915 to 1919, the activities being woodwork and other crafts of which he has no interest. In November 1918, Charles Lemser, finding his career in shambles, all of his property supposedly placed in safekeeping with neighbors in Dover, but having disappeared, and with the anti-German sentiment at high levels, Charles, totally disillusioned, relocated to Berlin and went to work eventually as an administrator in the German government. Against the strong wishes of her English family, my grandmother, without hesitation, followed him to Berlin with my mother literally in hand. They arrived on a very cold day in January 1919 at the main train station in Berlin, speaking no German and with only a suitcase. My mother was 8 and in effect herself a refugee. The train station in Berlin was filled with injured soldiers and refugees, and my mother remembers being very cold and scared as an 8-year-old sitting on a wooden bench and waiting until almost nightfall before her father arrived. Being English in a German world where the English were hated was not easy, and being only 8. She immediately was placed in German schools. There was no English as a second language or German as a second language with the Germans, so she was immediately placed in German schools and expected to learn German immediately. She was also left-handed, as I am, and that was not permitted in Berlin schools, and each use of the left hand was met with a swift hit on the hand with a ruler. Fortunately, it turned out that my mother had an extraordinary ability for languages and soon was fluent in German. She was also truly brilliant, and when all German children in Berlin were tested, she ranked in the top 1% and was moved into elite German school where she excelled. At age 14, my mother had completed all course of studies available to her unless she wanted to pursue academia, which she did not, and would have been unusual at that time. She did remember visiting great aunts who worked at the Egyptian Museum in the Charlottenburg section of Berlin, where Nefertiti's bust was displayed after its discovery in 1912. So, at the age of 14, my mother found herself needing to enter the working world in Berlin. She found employment in the thriving Berlin motion picture industry and was hired by Warner Brothers to be a film translator, and by the age of 18 was assistant to the Warner Brothers themselves when they came to the Berlin office. The 1920s into the 1930s Berlin was the center of the film industry. It was also an avant-garde environment with cutting-edge music, art, and literature combined with the rise of the Nazis. Mother was christened in the Church of England in Dover, but confirmed as a Lutheran in Berlin. She also held only a British passport since she was a British citizen. These attributes made her a valuable resource to the Warner Brothers, who were Jewish, originally from Poland. Their surname was von Slasker. Harry was Hirsch, Albert was Aaron, and Sam was Shmuel, and Jack was Isaac. The 3 oldest brothers had immigrated as refugees as well to Canada. Jack, the youngest, was born in London, Ontario. Sam and Jack produced the films, and Mom worked with Harry and Albert when they came to Berlin to work on finance and distribution of films. Mother translated into English the film version of Threepenny Opera in 1931 at the age of 20, and I have a purple hat from the Threepenny Opera. Somewhere in that storage unit is that purple hat with that ostrich feather. By the early 1930s, the Warner Brothers, being Jewish, realized they needed to close the Berlin office, although they kept a film distribution office there led by Philip Kaufman, who was murdered by the Nazis in Berlin in 1936. Mother assisted Warner Brothers in closing its production offices. During her time with the Warner Brothers, she met Greta Garbo and many of the film stars of the 1930s. Their Berlin production offices would have to be closed, and the German government had put restrictions on assets that could be removed from Berlin, especially of Jewish businesses. The costume designer made Mother a winter coat, and the buttons were covered in cloth. However, under the cloth were gold coins, which Mother walked out of the country to London for Warner Brothers, as she was Christian with a British passport, and at that time she had not drawn the attention of the Nazis. So from 1933, when her mother died back in England, Mother continued to live in Germany until 1935, after which she made visits to Germany frequently to visit friends. During her time working in Berlin, she was a member of the International Club, which had outings at Wannsee, an exclusive resort. This led to her deep friendships with the last of the Persian royal family, the Qajar family, which were then replaced by the Shah that we know about. There's a picture there of my mom on a horse, and if you remember, there was the Olympics coming up, the 36 Olympics and all that thing going on. And her friend was half Jewish, and he was to ride in the Olympics, and that wasn't going to work for the Nazis. So they took him off the equestrian team. The Germans won all 6 gold medals in the 36 Olympics. But that horse then went into the Olympics, ridden by a German Nazi, affiliate person. And then after that, Rommel took a shine to the horse, and that horse went to Rommel. He came and got it. So when Warner Brothers closed and the Nazis assumed more control, she made the decision to return to work in London for First National Pictures on Park Lane in London, First National having been acquired by Warner Brothers about 10 years earlier. Okay, during the frequent trips back to Berlin, again, she was British at that point and Christian, so she kind of could go back and forth. She assisted friends who needed to escape the Nazis. One family in particular is the Lungers, who I just mentioned about the horse. By 1936, Nazi oppression had intensified, and Mother stepped up her effort to assist Jewish families she knew to find a way out. Her last trip was to Berlin on Crystal Night of November 1938, which was pretty risky, when the windows of all Jewish shops were smashed. That trip, Mother received a call from British intelligence services, who she had no idea knew what she was doing, letting her know that she was on the list for investigation and interrogation. That day, British intelligence got her out of Berlin and back to London. She never put foot in Germany after 1938, thereby losing all contact with her father, who obviously could not return to England, and no record exists as to his fate. My mom remained an English citizen until she died in 1991, and this is one of the reasons that she said she couldn't give up her citizenship, because she said they saved her life that day. She also said unequivocally that the Germans knew what was being done to the Jews. A truck pulled up to a home or apartment, and the next day all furnishings were taken away and the families were gone. Yet another family destined for slave labor or death camps. Again, she was in Berlin, and that's her view of what she saw during that time. Mother spoke German as if a native and was especially skilled in German dialects as well as French. After working for First National in London, she was hired at Whitehall, which was the center of British government in London, to work for Lord Beaverbrook and Sir Eric Bowarder of the Ministry of Aircraft Production. Her office was on the second floor behind the cenotaph in the middle, because she took me to see it when I went with her to England. She remembered very fondly many visits by Jimmy Burns of South Carolina, who represented the Roosevelt administration and was well liked, highly trusted, and very influential with his distinctive eyebrows. I grew up in Columbia, and Jimmy Burns and Maude lived about 2 miles from our house, so it was kind of neat for them to get to reconnect. She strongly disliked Joe Kennedy, absolutely, who had pro-Nazi sympathies, and his anti-English, pro-Irish sentiment was well known. Didn't really like the Irish either, but she was English. Hours at Whitehall were long but rewarding. Her actual work there was highly secret. I don't really know what she did. She knew many of the code breakers who had been chosen in part by their ability to do crossword puzzles. I can remember Mother doing the New York Times crossword puzzles, always in ink, in about 30 minutes, saying the New York Times puzzle was really easy compared to the London puzzle. During the London Blitz from September 7th to 1940 to May 21st, 1941, she was bombed out of her flat 3 times. Mother was never explicit about her work at Whitehall. A childhood friend of mine who I saw this past weekend up in Winston-Salem, who lived on 2 doors up from us and was a real sponge about absorbing what my parents said. He said, "You left out something when you wrote this." And I said, "What? Remember she said nothing happened about D-Day unless it coming through her office first?" And I said, "I forgot about that." He said, "Well, did you forget about that she did the broadcast behind enemy lines once too?" I said, "I forgot about that one too." So adding that back in. I remember her talking about the lack of food, strict rationing of food and clothes, and having to work around the clock during the Blitz. She fainted from lack of food and exhaustion, and Lord Beaverbrook escorted her to the dining room where the heads of government gathered. She lived on Parliament Hill and Hampstead Heath for most of the war years after the Blitz. Her flatmate for a portion of this time was Iris Murdoch, who's a novelist who also went to work for UNRWA, where we'll talk about. Later a noted writer. I still have a white towel left behind which has Iris and a laundry ink on it so they wouldn't get their towels mixed up. And above was Eric Blair, who we all know as George Orwell. During air raid warnings, Eric would hide under Mother's bed. He was on the top floor, she had the bottom flat. He'd come and get under the bed or the sofa. And during air raid warnings, that's what he would do. Sigmund Freud lived in the neighborhood and would walk by in the mornings. He died 6 months prior to the Blitz. And she remembers telling me the putt-putt sound of the V1 that would come over, and when the putt-putt stopped, that means you may just be blown away at that point. The V2 was more like a cruise missile. It was faster than the speed of sound. So if you heard that sound, the bomb had already, it had already blown up. So I just can't imagine living day to day with those sounds above you. Just, I don't know how you do it. But the British did it. There was severe rationing in England of food, clothes, and housing during the war, and rationing continued into the early 1950s for many items, which I'll explain later. London was heavily damaged, and the recovery would be long. However, in 1943, Churchill and Roosevelt met to discuss the horrendous refugee situation that would develop if the Allies had victory. This planning was early indeed, but then the refugee crisis was expected to result in over 12 million refugees in just Germany and Austria alone. India and China were expected to have very high numbers as well. The planning was largely focused on anticipated widespread epidemics which occurred at the end of World War I, compounded by the flu outbreak killing millions. There was the fear of a complete breakdown in any functioning services after liberation due to the tremendous bombing of infrastructure. And several of you told me while I was getting ready to get up here, memories of your parents and seeing, many of the towns just totally decimated. My dad came in northern Germany with the UNRWA forces, and when you see pictures of Hamburg and Bremen, there's nothing there. So in 1943, the Allied powers representing 44 countries founded the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Agency, which is referred to as UNRWA, to plan for the refugee situation. That was at that time unrelated to the UN, which was of course founded in October of 1945. Herbert Lehman was the first head of UNRWA. He was the former governor of New York, followed by LaGuardia, mayor of New York, and finally by Major General Lowell Brooks of the U.S. Army. That's my dad. He was from Orangeburg County, from a little town called Roseville, and he finished University of South Carolina in social work in 1938, was assigned to Defusky with the WPA to deal with the closing of the oyster factory. During World War II, he was a testing kind of person, so he gave IQ tests. So if you went through Biloxi, Mississippi, or San Antonio, you got an IQ test, and if you were smart, you went somewhere in the Army, and if you weren't so smart, you went they trained you for a gun and you were shipped out. So that was how it was done. So he had that background in testing and in social services, and he was recruited by UNRWA to go to Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany after the liberation of the concentration camp. So that's how he's going to get over to the same place where my mom is, who's English, and is going to be joining UNRWA and going into the Austrian group. So Allied powers anticipated the refugee situation would be primarily dealing with slave laborers forced from the Russian territories, Ukraine, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Baltics. What was not anticipated were the horrors that had occurred within the concentration camps, although they were known to exist, and the strongest desire of such survivors not to be returned to the countries from which they were deported. Jews that returned to Poland found that there was no property to claim, and in most cases, no relatives survived, and an estimated 1,200 were killed upon return. Anti-Semitism was still very much alive in Poland, and we're seeing some evidence of that again. When Dad was at Bergen-Belsen, it was eventually the only Jewish displaced camp, exclusively Jewish. And initially it had Poles there that weren't Jewish. And the Jewish refugees that ended up at Bergen-Belsen were not just the concentration camp survivors, but also other Jewish refugees trying to stay ahead of the Red Army. And the Poles wanted to go back, and the first train of Poles went back, and they were shot when they got off the train. All of them were killed, men, women, and children. And so Dad worked with the British Army to basically prohibit any more trains going back to Poland. It's unbelievable kind of how horror people can be. After liberation by the Allied powers, Germany and Austria and Italy were divided into 4 zones under the control of the Allied powers. That's what your map is. The US zone, the British zone, the French zone, and the Russian zone. Each zone had camps set up to house and feed displaced persons, which were defined initially as people not in their country of origin in 1945, and you could not be ethnic Germans. In 1946, the German Jews were given a special classification under displaced persons, because technically they weren't going to be displaced persons because they were German. But if you were a displaced person, or a DP, as they were called, you were entitled to better rations, access to medical care, and eventually a way out of the camps. Non-DP status left you without this support. They were initially administered by the Allied powers, subject to the authority of the supreme headquarters of the Allied expeditionary forces in Europe. So they had kind of semi-military status. They had uniforms. They worked together with, not against, the Allied powers who had divvied up these two countries. So the Allied powers, the military turned the camps in 1946 over to UNRWA, and both of my parents joined UNRWA in the fall of '45 and got their assignments. My mother's assignment in Salzburg was, I think, to watch the Russians, but that's not ever what she said it was. But she was chief travel officer eventually, and so any body coming through these zones, or any trains going through these zones, had to get clearance through her office, and she would do all the translations. But it basically let her know where everybody was going. So over 90% of the Jews who ended up at Bergen-Belsen displaced camp wanted to get to Palestine. The British policy during World War II was to cultivate an alliance with the Arabs in Palestine as part of the campaign to have a successful Middle East campaign against the Nazis. Looking at diplomatic correspondence, the British preferred that the 1.2 million remaining Jews in Europe be reestablished in Europe and not Palestine, afraid of the instability it would cause if a Jewish state were established in the Arab territories. And the US nor any of the Allied powers were really interested in taking a large number of Jews. My father directly accounted this attitude in the camps he supervised, and specifically in welfare programs at Bergen-Belsen in the British zone as a UNRWA employee. Although official policy was to have no more than 100,000 Jews authorized to go to Palestine, reality was that the U.S. allowed Jews into the camps with falsified travel papers and facilitated the flow of Jews to France to be placed on ships to Palestine. So Dad said that if they would get all the legal visas to go to Palestine in '46 were all given to Bergen-Belsen. And so Bergen-Belsen had them. And what Dad said would happen is they would get their visa, get on the ship, throw the visa back on the dock. They would pick up the visas, go back to Bergen-Belsen, and all of a sudden another person appeared with the same name. And they would manufacture passports. And all this was done as an American. Dad was told that's okay. The British were like, that's not okay. We think this is not a good idea. But in the end, Israel got established. Another unanticipated refugee situation was the displaced persons from areas now controlled by Russia who did not want to return to their country of origin. The agreement at Potsdam was that the displaced persons had to be returned to the country of origin except for Jews. The Russians said, that's okay, you don't need to send them back. For Poles that were anti-communist pre-World War II, they know this meant immediate death upon return to Poland or Russia. So when Polish refugees started committing suicide rather than to be turned over to the Russians for transport back, the U.S. Army stepped in and began not to enforce the policy of sending people back to Russia. The Russians took the viewpoint that if you were a slave labor and you had been working in the German munition plants under gunpoint, you should have committed suicide rather than done that. So if you didn't commit suicide then, they would help you do it when you got back. And there's really bad. I went to a trip in Spain with my sister-in-law, and there was a young man, a geologist there who was English, and he said his father had been in one of the displaced camps in Austria. And if you look at Austria, it's divided up with the Soviet zone and all that. And he thought he had entered a U.S. DP camp. He woke up the next morning, and the U.S. had traded it for another camp, and he was in a Russian DP camp. And he was like, this is not going to work out well. And he'd been a slave laborer in a munitions plant, so he knew what was going to happen to him. And he said his father, who was Ukrainian actually, saw a tractor in the fields outside the camp. These camps had like 30,000, 40,000 people. They were huge. And he jumped over, got on the tractor and started heading west. He just drove this tractor till he found another U.S. Army displaced person camp and said, take me in, and they did. Because he knew that he said his father always wanted to go back to the Ukraine, but was always scared to do it, but he asked in the end to be buried in the Ukraine, but he never was able to get back. Another source of unanticipated refugees were the large numbers who wanted not to be under the Red Army regardless, and millions of families fled west toward Germany to find safe harbor in the U.S. or British zones, and that's an example. Another very tragic source of refugees were children, part of the Lebensborn program. This program started with the idea of importing tall, blue-eyed Norwegians to father children of SS officers. The program was expanded by the Nazis so that blonde, blue-eyed children seen in playgrounds or even families, many from Poland and Czechoslovakia, were forcibly taken from the Germans and placed with families. An entire division of UNRWA, and my mom said a lot of that was what helped. They used CARE as the international organization worked with UNRWA. They worked to reunite the children with parents. Only about 10% of such children were reunited with their families. The illegitimate children of the SS were often abandoned. One UNRWA worker described sleeping at the door of the main camp barracks in order to hear the knock on the door and find young children homeless standing outside. There were also refugees in Vienna left over from the Russian Revolution, which for some reason my mom was assigned the white Russians, and she went to tea with them in the afternoons, and they would use their tea bags over and over and over again, and she said appear in black lace tea dresses from the 1905 era, and they're trying to maintain some type of pride, but none of their British cousins wanted them, so they were just kind of holed up in Vienna, where they had been since the Bolsheviks. They eventually found ways out, but they were extremely in dire poverty. Finally, after World War II ended in June, the countries that had territories annexed by Germany, such as Poland, expelled any people who were ethnically German and by definition could not be a displaced person. So you had all these people who were really displaced persons, but they couldn't be because they were German, and if you were German, you couldn't be a displaced person. But what did you do with these people? So they were all around. There was good medical care. That was one thing the U.S. and the British did, is because they thought they were going to have epidemics of all kinds of things. They were really staffed up well in doctors and epidemiologist type people. So you've got 11 million people in Germany, all in the U.S., and Germany and Austria all in the U.S. and British zones. So this was an incredible amount of people to absorb into the camp. Soon there were hostilities in the camp. This was solved by setting up camps by ethnic groups. The Jews demanded their own camps, as they did in Bergen-Belsen, and it became clear that the Poles were the least desirable to have in the camps. The Polish camps were deemed to be dirtier than the other camps. This is just how people thought about things. Separate camps were created for the Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanians, which overall came from a more educated class than the Poles, and these refugees were referred to as the Balts. Food became an immediate problem. The Germans were required to provide food from German farms for the camps upon the orders of the Allied powers. The winter of 45-46 was one of the coldest on record, and fuel for heating was rationed, and my dad, being from South Carolina, got pneumonia and got really sick that winter. The Allied powers realized that there would be mass famine. England had to return to even stricter rationing of the civilian population in order to free up wheat for bread production for the refugees in Germany and Austria. And the U.S. was devoting more grain to cattle, and there were political issues in freeing up grain and other products for shipment to Germany. So it was really a mess there. You were trying to build up a peacetime economy. At the same time, you had 11 million people who weren't supposed to be where they were, and you had to do something with them. The Jewish camps posed additional problems. No one was prepared for the psychological damage on the survivors of the concentration camps, especially the children. Upon liberation by the Allied armies, many Jews died because of the response of the military was to give the Jews food of the types and quantities which their weakened bodies could not absorb. Over 2,000 Jews died within days of liberation. 200,000 survived the concentration camps. It is estimated that 2 months earlier, 500,000 Jews were alive, so 300,000 in Bergen-Belsen were killed in less than a month. As we know, Anne Frank perished in Bergen-Belsen just a month before liberation. The main building at Bergen-Belsen was actually burned by the British Army due to rampant typhoid, and Bergen-Belsen was set up in a former SS area that was adjacent to it. The British tried to rename Bergen-Belsen another name, Hohne, but the Jews would not agree to that. They continued to call it Bergen-Belsen. So where we are now is that in 1946, a decision was made to assess the work skills of the displaced persons and to try to rehabilitate them and disperse this 11 million. In this, let me give you an aside here. This is in Salzburg, Austria, where my mother was first stationed. And does anybody know what that scene is? That's Hitler's eagle's nest at the back. And there's pictures you can see, you've seen probably famous pictures of Hitler in a trench coat walking that same path. But that was done by one of the displaced persons as a thank you for what my mom had done to help that person find a new life in another country. We're going to go into how the Allied powers came in and what they did. So here we go. In many Allied nations, the displaced persons filled the void in agricultural labor left by the return of prisoners of war. Nearly 3 years after the end of the war, over 1 million German and Austrian POWs were still being used for labor. The New York Times referred it to as the new slavery. More than half were held in the Soviet Union, which did not release their prisoners until 1955. But many countries also hung on to their prisoners. It's not good to be a prisoner in Russia. The Americans had repatriated 1/4 of the POWs they had, but then they loaned 600,000 to the French to do agricultural work, another 30,000 to the Belgians. By the end of 1947, there were hardly any German prisoners left in the U.S., but France still had some 383,000 German prisoners, and they were really good workers, and the French held on to them as long as possible. The British, too, dragged their feet. By November 1946, only 31,000 of the 385,000 POWs held in Britain had been sent home. After criticism in press and parliament, for a time the repatriation rate rose to 20,000 returnees in a month. But at the end of 1947, there were still almost 200,000 German POWs in Britain, mostly working in agricultural positions. By then, however, the British had begun to recruit displaced persons. There was nothing humanitarian about their initiative. Rather, it was a cold-blooded labor recruiting program driven by hard economics. The Attlee government's only chance of staving off national bankruptcy while trying to maintain a position of a great power with substantial forces stationed overseas and a high percentage of the country's manpower still in the armed forces to stabilize Europe rested on economic recovery here, and using POWs, using refugees was a way to kind of fill this void. In the coal industry, the more powerful National Union of Mine Workers was bribed to accept foreigners by the introduction of a 5-day work week in May of 1947. But there still remained severe labor shortages. Finding domestic staff to work in hospitals was especially difficult. So British attention now focused on the DP camps as a labor force. British officials and relief workers agreed that the Balts, this middle class, well-organized, industrious, anxious to please, quote, racially compatible, in the case of Latvians and Estonians, Protestant by religion, would be the easiest to assimilate in Great Britain or her dominions. There were collaborations among them as in every country of occupied Europe. Initially, the British took only Balts and Ukrainians, but the net was eventually widened to include Poles, Yugoslavs, Hungarians, Bulgarians, Czechs, and Slovaks, and a few carefully vetted Volksdeutsche, those expelled from Poland and the Ukraine. Between 1946 and 51, a total of 81,000 DPs were admitted under the two British schemes, and most made a favorable adjustment, with only 4,000 insisting on returning to Germany and Austria. There's a book up here that was done by a DP camp for people from Slovenia, and that was dedicated to my mom as well. And it'll show you pictures of the camps and the huge fields they were farming and the crafts they were making and some of the medical facilities they had. The Belgians were not so successful. They suffered heavy damage in the war and had a considerable manpower shortage too. Under an agreement reached June 11, 1947, the Belgian government agreed to admit 50,000 DPs to work as coal miners, promising equal working conditions, the right to Social Security benefits, and Belgian citizenship after a period of 5 years. Unlike the British, they laid down no restrictions on nationality. But the Belgium scheme was not a success. Conditions in the mines were very severe, and the DPs were given the worst jobs. At the same time, many unsuitable men had applied, and the medical vetting had been very cursory for the Belgians, and so that a lot of people didn't want to be coal miners. So a chorus of complaints and demands to return to Germany could be heard, and then the International Refugee Organization, UNRWA, kind of morphed into IRO, which in 1948 basically assumed the UNRWA duties. So mom and dad became IRO employees kind of like overnight. The IRO persuaded the French to take more DP workers with their families, and ultimately 30,000 refugees found home in France, while a further 5,000 were taken by Morocco, Tunisia, and French Guiana. However, DPs were reluctant to go into mining and agriculture where their labor was most needed. Equally, the Swedish offered to accept 10,000 single Baltic refugees was not attractive and was taken up by only 4,300 DPs, because if you were, especially a Baltic, you kind of had your choice here. By far, the most generous offer came from Turkey, which agreed to take all 3,000 plus Muslim DPs, which were the Albanians and Yugoslavs who had tried to get ahead of the Red Army, regardless of their fitness for work, and offered them immediate Turkish citizenship. Among them, the nations of Western Europe would eventually take 170,000 refugees, a fifth of the remaining 1 million that they had a hard time figuring out what to do with. By 1947, it was becoming clear that a permanent solution for the refugee problem would only be found overseas, and that's looking in North and South America and the British Commonwealth. There wasn't that much more the European countries could do, because they were already under so much rationing and housing was a problem. This is what is an interesting parallel to today, and we'll wind it up pretty soon. Canada would probably not have taken any refugees at all had public opinion had its way. An interesting parallel to the anti-immigration sentiment we see now. An opinion poll in 1946 revealed widespread hostility to immigration, with only 37% of Canadians willing to consider Northern European DPs, and an overwhelming majority opposed to Eastern European and Southern European immigrants. In 1946, Canada launched a scheme whereby displaced persons who already had relatives in Canada could join them, which was expected to bring some 30,000 people to the country. A year later, a labor selection scheme followed, under which the IRO was to provide Canada with DPs capable of working as miners, loggers, farm workers, general laborers, domestics. DPs going to Canada would have to sign a 2-year contract for a specific occupation. There was a story told by the Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, told Parliament. He said, from the start, Canadian officials had clear preferences, and if you wanted to go to Canada, you normally thought you were going to go there to do working with timber. You're going to be heavy industrial. So if you were a DP and you wanted to go to Canada, but you really had a PhD in Portuguese or something, the idea was that when the Canadian labor recruiter came to the camp, you were supposed to squeeze his hand as hard as you could so they would feel that you were a worker, which was not that successful, but that was the whole idea to get to Canada. By 1947, Australia's need for workers was becoming critical, but the country also wanted to boost its population for strategic reasons. The Second World War had dramatized its global isolation and left its politicians fearful of Japanese aggression at a time of waning British power in the Far East. We must populate or we must perish, or we will perish, declared Arthur Caldwell, who was Australia's first minister for immigration. We must fill this country or we will lose it. So feeling that the current population of 7 million, about 1 person per square mile, left a land as vast as Australia unprotected, Caldwell aimed to increase the population to 20 million by the end of the 20th century, an average rate of 2% per year. Most of the countries would not let you bring your dependents, and that was a real problem, because the dependents meant you had to have housing, you couldn't put people in dormitories, you had to have food, you had to provide education. So a lot of these DPs had to go to these countries and leave family behind and then establish themselves and then see if they could get them in, which is kind of a really hard thing to think after all you've gone through. The United States was for many DPs the first choice, but the Americans took their time to agree and implement their policy on DP settlements. Eventually they did, but Canada and Australia really had much more. Each country had slightly different criteria for selection, so we're now moving to Brazil, because we kind of run out of Canada and Australia and New Zealand and Western Europe, so we're now looking at Brazil. So they wanted agricultural workers without young children of all nationalities, but would not accept Jews or people of Asiatic origin. Luxembourg, again, with single workers, no dependents, prefer Balts. Holland, jobs for tailors and weavers. But most countries were looking for young, strong males without dependents and who were not Jewish. Was where it was. This all kept on going through. Getting the last 1 million took until 1952 to get them out of Europe and get them all into places. So it took until 1952 to complete the process of closing the camps in the British and American zones. And in 1952, the duties of UNRWA, which had been assumed by IRO, were assumed by the United States Commission of Refugees, United Nations Commission on Refugees. In 1951, my mother immigrated to Canada, and my father returned to Orangeburg County to help his family manage lots and lots of cotton land, rather than taking an assignment with the IRO in China, which is where they wanted him to go. In December 1952, they reunited, got married at Niagara Falls. My mother moved to Orangeburg County, my mother having only lived in Berlin, London, Vienna, and Salzburg. If you took the train to Roseville, there was not a station there. They just slowed the train down. And mother remembers jumping out of the train, and when she got there, she still had this, I don't like furs, but she had a Persian lamb coat, a silver fox coat. She had all these things that she had from the lifestyle she had had, and there she was in Orangeburg County in the summer. So Dad was hired by American Red Cross in 1953 to handle aid to military families all through South Georgia and northern Florida, where there are a lot of air bases. So they moved to Waycross, Georgia from Roseville, South Carolina, and they lived next to an alligator wrestler, who my mother was always grateful to because he let her watch the coronation of the Queen on June 2nd, 1953, because he had a television. So she watched the coronation of Queen Elizabeth with this alligator wrestler in the Okefenokee Swamp. So they then got back to South Carolina. My dad was head of the Red Cross in Columbia, which also had the blood program, which is different than it is in this part of the state. But he was responsible for blood program for all the hospitals from Charleston up to Newberry. And then in 1962, he stayed with Red Cross until he retired around 1972. But in 1962, he completed a refugee exchange. The U.S. decided to trade pharmaceuticals with Castro as a result of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. So he went to Switzerland, trained up on that, took a boatload of pharmaceuticals from Swiss Red Cross, and went to Hemingway's house in Havana, outside of Havana, and stayed 2 weeks and negotiated a release of about 600 or 800 people who had been interned, for lack of a better word, by Castro. And that's his citation from General Grunther, who was the head of the Red Cross at that time, commending him for his bravery and valor. So finally, I'm sorry to go late here, lessons learned from my mother's observations of these times. The Germans after World War I were thrown into dire economic situation as punishment for starting World War I. Hyperinflation set in so that bread could cost 1 million marks in the morning and 10 million marks by the end of the day. I know I stood in those bread lines. When presented with an alternative which provided employment and restored pride, the Germans took it, even if it meant the Nazis. The Germans knew that Jews were being deported in large numbers and can't deny this knowledge. It happened so frequently and openly. And after the war, they were forced to watch films on Lest You Forget. Although the U.S. is a melting pot, the rest of the world often is not. Separate camps divided along ethnic lines were essential to maintain order. Families can be living normal lives, just as we do, and a knock on the door at night, and they're gone with no intervention by anyone. World events of which you have no control can radically change one's circumstances, as it did my mother when she found herself as an 8-year-old sitting on a bench at the train station in Berlin in a very cold day, January 1919. Through no fault or action of your own, you can be the person without food and shelter and at the mercy of others to survive. Don't think it can't happen to you. Finally, the Americans always got the better positions, even though the British were much smarter. That's it. So, thank you. Well, I went over time, so I apologize, but I hope you found something of interest, and it is a remarkable part of history, and I'm really proud my parents were part of it. So feel free to look at anything you want to see up here, and I can answer questions, but I only know what my parents told me, so I'm not good at that. My friend in Winston-Salem I saw this past weekend who grew up next to me, as did Catherine Pugh, who's back there. Now Cuneo, she grew up on Milford Road in Columbia too, knew my mom. But, my problem was my mom was just different, and she spoke with probably more of a German accent than an English, and all the other moms were doing normal things, and my mom was talking about this. So I didn't appreciate it at the time, but I did start appreciating it before she died, so I did listen, and she wrote down some things, not a lot, but she wrote down some things to give me some actual words. But my friend and I remember just hearing her talk a lot about it, and I'm glad we absorbed what we did, and I hope people I was talking to Tom Lee, there are people in this room who can tell the same stories. You were talking to me, there are projectionists about things that your father did in Panama. I mean, there's stories all over this city where they can give similar stories. We just need to remember them and not forget them. All right. Yeah.
I think you all will agree with me that America may have more than 30 Greenvilles, but Greenville, South Carolina is the only one that's got Kathy McKinney. When you read things that are good about this city, I think Kathy represents what's the best about this city.